Rusty Quill presents The Magnus Archives. Episode 51, High Pressure.
Statement of Antonia Haley regarding a deep dive that took place near Sable Island, Nova Scotia, in August 2006. Original statement given January 7th, 2008. Audio recording by Jonathan Sims, head archivist of the Magnus Institute, London. Statement begins. I should be dead, really. It's a weird feeling. You ever had a near-death experience? I've had a few. They're not uncommon in my line of work, but this,
Medea came to the
it feels different. It's not that I put myself in danger and managed not to die. I should be dead. Decompression sickness that severe is almost never survivable, and I should have had an embolism. The fact that I didn't? Blind luck. It's hard to reconcile yourself with avoiding a death that you feel should have been yours.
Hello there, hero.
There'd
I
been
come
others
across
with me who
old
didn't make it if I could write it off as survivor's guilt, but I was alone. Do you ever get that? Of course you didn't decide. Anyway, I'm not here to talk about that. I'm a diver, both by nature and by trade. I grew up in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and was swimming almost before I was walking. I did my first scuba dive at 8 years old. It was barely deeper than a swimming pool, but it was enough to instill a lifelong passion for it. I got fully qualified as soon as I was legally able and almost flunked out of college because I was always running off to some dive or other. I must have missed more classes than I went to by the end. I scraped by, but as it turned out, even if I hadn't, it wouldn't have mattered too much, as it wasn't my psychology major that got me my first job after graduation. It was diving. I worked at a marine salvage company based off the coast of Nova Scotia. You'll forgive me if I don't give their name. I still hold out hope I might go back to work there someday. And I'd feel like an asshole dragging their name through the mud, even if it is just to you and your strict confidentiality procedures. If you're desperate, they shouldn't be hard to identify, but it's not really relevant to what happened. You ever heard of the Graveyard of the Atlantic? Probably not, and it's a confusing name anyway, since it actually refers to two distinct locations along the eastern coast of North America, both notorious hotspots for shipwrecks. In this case, I'm talking about the one of Sable Island in Nova Scotia. The waters there are some of the roughest, where the Gulf Stream hits the Labrador Current, and depending on which historical records you believe, there could be anything from 400 to 600 shipwrecks down there. And that's only from when the European settlers first arrived. Normally, it's not the sort of place where we would accept jobs. It's too dangerous to send a salvage crew in when the waters are that unpredictable. But this time was different. Maybe the old man was just a real sweet talker, or maybe he swipped the captain, a leathery old cuss by the name of Morton Kemp, just enough extra under the table that he fudged the location on the release forms. Either way, word came down that we were doing a dive off Sable Island. None of that was to say the captain was stupid about it. We kept a very close eye on the meteorological reports and only headed into the graveyard when we were certain we'd have a window of relatively calm seas to do it. It helped that the job was relatively simple. The old man, Simon Fairchild, had come to us claiming that he had pinpointed the location he believed his great-grandfather's sailing yacht had been sunk almost 120 years ago, and he was keen to retrieve any heirlooms or curios he could from it. The only thing interesting or unusual about his story was the amount of money he was willing to throw around to back it up. It was certainly enough to get us dropping anchor 100 miles from the coast on a hot, sunny morning at the end of August. The journey out had been a bit subdued. Normally, me and Julio Hernandez, the other diver on the crew, would spend our time chatting, playing cards, and once even screwing, though we generally don't talk about that. This time we had to babysit Mr. Fairchild, who had stubbornly insisted that he make the journey with us. Again, this wouldn't normally have been an option, but the guy was not shy about throwing his money around. He must have been pushing 100 years old, just a tiny pink skeleton of a man sat in the corner watching us the whole trip. It was hard to get any sort of friendly chat going with him perched there like some sort of vulture. I tried to talk to him a few times, but he only seemed interested in discussing this shipwreck and how preserved I thought everything might be. I told him I had no idea, as it really wasn't my area. I was just the diver. He didn't say much to me after that. When we hit the graveyard, the sea was almost completely still, far more so than I would have expected, even given the weather predictions we'd been working with. It didn't strike me as odd at the time, just an unexpected bit of help with the job. Initial checks managed to locate a wreck that seemed to match the old man's description, a steam yacht, circa 1890. It seemed to be in surprisingly good shape, and in the camera's torchlight, we could just about make out the name, the Maria Fairchild. The old man was practically dancing with joy, and I was genuinely concerned he might give himself a heart attack. We suited up and prepared to go under. The wreck was at a depth of 160 feet, which meant we'd be in a high-pressure environment, but we shouldn't need hypoxic gas or full-pressure suits, which was something of a relief. Julio made his prayers, Captain Kemp gave us a stern nod, and into the water we went. As I went in, I thought I heard Simon, the old man, shout after me, but I couldn't make it out. And then the world was nothing but silent blue. I'd expected the water to be warmer, given the temperature on the surface, but the chill hit me all at once, and it took a moment to get to grips with it. I saw Julio next to me, a few yards away, and with a thumbs up, we began to dive down.
Already I see sails on the horizon.
Most people don't appreciate how quickly it gets dark underwater. You don't need to be nearly as deep as you think before the sun is just the faintest change in the water hues. If you're not careful, it's easy to forget which way is up and become lost in the murky depths. But Julio and I were a well-practiced team, and we weren't going so far down as to face any darkness that our torches couldn't handle. It was during that descent when I saw that our 2 points of light were the only signs of movement down there, that I noticed the absence of life. I wasn't particularly worried by this. If anything, I was rather relieved. Anyone who's been diving more than a few years will be able to tell you of at least one close call with a shark, and I'd had 2 so far, so the less movement the better as far as I was concerned. Still, it was a surprise that we hadn't seen even a single school of fish on our journey to the sea floor. Once we were down there, it was just as lifeless. I gestured my confusion to Julio, but he just shrugged and started over towards the wreck. Down there, deep below the surface, I find myself sometimes entering an almost meditative state. I feel the weight of the world, a world you were never meant to be part of, pressing in on you from all directions, and a constant, overpowering awareness of your own breathing, of how little there is between you and the very space around you that is completely hostile to your existence. The danger is real, as is the faint, hardened fear in your gut. I've always found that it sometimes put me in a state not too unlike how it feels staring into the flames of a fire. Hypnotic. My mind cleared of all thoughts but the dull, pulsing rush of adrenaline. That feeling was so strong here that I almost swam past the Maria Fairchild completely. Julio was already inside, and I quickly located a large enough tear in the hull and made my own entrance. The yacht was bigger than I had thought when viewing it from the boat, but the layout was not complicated, and we already had quite a good idea about where would be best to look for the sort of antiques and sentimental treasures that Simon wanted. Julio had taken the bedroom, so I started on the bridge. It was certainly an impressive sight. A late 19th century steam yacht, slightly decayed from its time on the ocean floor, but all in all, astoundingly well preserved. I looked over the chair and the various panels and controls, but could find nothing which could be classed as an easily removable heirloom, although I did make a mental note of which bits of the bridge were well enough preserved that they might be worth removing. It would need more equipment than we had with us, but I could suggest it to Simon if we returned empty-handed. I checked in on Julio, but he was still busy ransacking the bedroom, so I decided to do a sweep of the engine room. It was there I found the hole. It was large, maybe 7 feet in diameter, not unlike the one I had used to get into the wreck in the first place. There was something about it that immediately put me on edge. The shape was too regular somehow, the water outside it was too dark, and it took me a few seconds to notice this. But the direction of the tearing seemed to indicate it had been made from the inside out. I dropped the rusted wrench I had been examining and let it float slowly towards the floor as I made my way to the hole. I gripped the side and looked through. As soon as I put my head through, I felt a change wash over me. The pressure increased all at once, becoming so intense that I screamed in surprise and pain as my head erupted in agony. The pressure was upon my whole body now, and I was finding it hard to move with the crushing weight on every part of me. My eyes bulged as I stared forward, and I saw two things. The first was that below the hole there was no sea floor, just a deep and endless expanse of empty water, as though the boat were on a cliff edge. The second was that it was far, far too dark. The deepest that humans can survive in the ocean is the mesopelagic zone, which begins roughly 650 feet below the surface. It is colloquially known among oceanographers as the twilight zone, as it is the level where only the faintest of light penetrates from the sun, and the water can only be seen in the many shades of darkness. Down that far, any glow that makes it is so diffused as to be utterly useless in determining which way is up. But as I stared out in terror, I was absolutely sure that there was no up, and I could swim as far as I liked. There would never be anything but water. Then I saw it. It was only a shadow in the dark, but it was there, and it was huge. It stretched from one side of my vision to the other, and as I fought against the pressure to turn my aching head, I still couldn't see the end of it. Only its blurred outline, slightly better contrasted against the lighter shade of the twilight water that surrounded it. I could not see the ends of it. It was so big it made me lightheaded to think about it, to try and place myself in some believable scale against it. I think it was a hand. I could not see enough to be sure. It moved, slowly but clearly, and I realized how far away it still was. As it got bigger and bigger and bigger, and I could see nothing else, and I screamed. It was the jagged metal of the hole itself that saved me in the end. As I cried out in horror, I felt the sharp edges of it digging into my hands, and they gripped it, and the unexpected burst of pain snapped me out of whatever it was that held me in place. With a surge of strength, I pushed myself back into the boat, and I felt the pressure lift all at once. Of course, this brought its own set of problems, but I didn't care. The lightheadedness was already setting in, and my vision was blurring when I swam out of the sunken ship and headed towards the surface at full speed, ignoring all decompression procedures. I blacked out 30 feet from the surface. I have vague memories of the trip back, fading in and out of consciousness, feeling the worst I have ever felt in my life. Then I recall a helicopter, shouting, and finally waking up fully in a hospital bed. Captain Kemp was there, and he immediately laid into me, calling me all sorts of horrendous names before informing me exactly how serious my condition had been, and how lucky I was to be alive. I should be dead, he told me, and I know he was right. I left the company soon afterwards. I still plan to go back someday, but it'll be a while longer before I'm comfortable in the water. Julio never came to visit me in hospital, and I was unable to get in contact with him after I was discharged. I hope he's alright. I did ask Captain Kemp what happened to the job after I left, as I also hadn't seen the old man since that morning. The captain got a strange look in his eyes then, and gazed out of the window with a scowl I had never seen on his face before. The sea is a dangerous place, he walked away. Statement ends. No real follow-up can be made to this statement, as it all took place in Canadian territory. We don't have the contacts over there that we do here. Not to mention that what little I could glean appears to be a mass of overlapping and conflicting police, coast guard, and port authority reports. We could spend years trying to unravel this one case if we had a mind to, and I, for one, do not. We weren't even able to glean sufficient information to track down any of those mentioned in the statement, aside from Captain Morton Kemp, who now runs boat tours near Winnipeg and declined to comment on it in the strongest possible terms. Instead, I will focus on Simon Fairchild, who I recall may have come up in case 0022010, along with a young woman. I may have encountered Fairchild before, or it may just be a coincidence of names. One of my first cases as a researcher, in 2012, was looking into the history of the jewelers in Hackney that had reported cases becoming cracked in the night. Nothing was ever taken, but each morning it would be like a heavy weight had been dropped upon them. Looking into it, it turned out that the jewelers had, in the 1930s, belonged to a con artist and fence who had attracted the displeasure of the local population. When one particularly irate customer threw him out of a fourth-floor window into a crowded street at midday, no one claimed to have seen anything. A minor possible haunting with a decidedly pedestrian backstory, but notable because while I was never able to discover the original name of the con artist, one of his many, many aliases was Simon Fairchild, and it appeared on several business listings around the time. Whether it's a coincidence or not is something of a moot point at this stage, however. A cursory bit of research proves the Fairchilds in question to be an exceptionally wealthy family based down in Cornwall. No real business to speak of, but it appears they've invested very wisely in aerospace technology, shipping logistics, and underwater drilling and construction. Whatever their origin, I feel it's worth keeping an eye on them. End report. Supplemental. I had a strange conversation with Sasha. I've been doing some research into her, but there's little to go on, save that she worked in artifact storage. I decided to pay it a short visit to acquaint myself with any new acquisitions. Not much worth reporting, really. A new oak wardrobe, light is apparently unable to penetrate, a carved rock eye they keep in a black velvet bag, apparently it interferes with the video cameras otherwise, and a rather nasty-looking scalpel that is supposedly rife with disease, no matter what they use to sterilize or disinfect it. That one's kept in a hermetically sealed plastic box. I stumbled across Sasha, staring at that damn table. Luckily, I had the wherewithal to bring my tape recorder and managed to turn it on unnoticed. Recording follows. It's fascinating, isn't it? In the literal sense, I mean.
Yes. Sometimes I can't pull myself away from it.
Given recent events, I've been trying to figure out if it's a fractal.
No, it isn't. I've always seen it more like a web.
I guess it has caught us in its own way.
I don't think we're the first to be caught.
No?
I believe it caught Graham as well.
I thought that was... Whatever crawled through his window. Unless you think they're linked.
I doubt it. It didn't sound like the sort of thing that would want to be bound to an object.
I suppose. And we haven't seen any long-limbed stalkers, so let's concentrate on the table.
Agreed. If you'll excuse me?
Of course. Odd, but not alarming, though I think I may discuss restricting her access to the table with Elias. Oh, and I've found out where she's been going when she takes extra long lunch breaks. It seems harmless enough, but I admit I'm a bit baffled. Every few days, she travels up to Baker Street to spend anywhere from 10 minutes to a full hour in Madame Tussauds Wax Museum. And supplement.
Rusty Quill presents the Magnus Archive. Episode 52. Exceptional Risk.
Statement of Philip Brown, regarding his time working at HMP Wakefield between 1990 and 2002. Original statement given April 9, 2004. Audio recording by Jonathan Sims, head archivist of the Magnus Institute, London. Statement begins. How much do you know about the prison service? Not much, I'd bet. Maybe you've seen a few prison movies. Think you know a bit about how it is in there. You've got to keep face and watch your back, right? After all, you never know who's got a shiv with your name on it. Well, for a start, you're probably thinking of American movies about American prisons, and I can't speak to that. Maybe it is non-stop gang warfare over there, but in my experience, the biggest danger in a prison is, and always will be, boredom. I say that like it's some glib observation, but we work hard to keep it as boring as possible. The first hint of violence among the inmates gets smacked down. I worked as a prison officer in Her Majesty's Prison Wakefield, or the Monster Mansion, as the press insists on calling it. It houses the real scum of this country. Class A dangers, the lot of them, and it was always a point of pride to me that we kept that place quiet. I mean, I say it like I had any real power, but I was just a grunt, keeping an eye on a cage full of wild animals. I won't even pretend I was proportional in my use of force. I mean, prison inspector would have been over that with me already, but the sort of things you have to have done to end up in Wakefield. Well, let's just say the suicide attempts far outnumbered the murder attempts, and I never lost any sleep over that fact, nor did any of the inmates. I made sure of that. After lockup at 7 p.m. sharp, I made a point of keeping my wing dark and quiet. It helped that they were single cells, of course. No worries about conversation or violence between cellmates. But even then I was careful to make it very clear that drawing my attention after lights out
Not enough energy.
was something they would regret. I'll admit,
My mistress,
I was
the
a real
Lady
bastard
Medina,
when I
is-
worked there. Sometimes you need a bastard to keep an eye on the monsters.
You
And
kill.
back then,
I have
I
work to
really
do.
thought that the murderous filth we were looking after were the closest thing this world had to real monsters.
It is only a
I was
lamp.
wrong, of course. I'd been working there for almost 5 years when Robert Montauk
I
came
think
to us.
I have it now. The
Now,
night
don't get me
blossoms.
wrong, we've had plenty of celebrity criminals pass through Wakefield over the
There
years,
once was
but I
Egypt as a
can't say
colony.
it didn't give me a slight chill to know that we were going to be keeping watch over the most prolific British serial killer of all time. I mean, he killed 40 people. That's a ridiculous number. I mean, maybe in America, where you have so many places to hide, but his nearest competition in this country barely reached half that. And he used to be a policeman. All told, you have the ingredients for a cocktail of posturing, unrest, and violence among certain quarters of the inmates. He wouldn't normally have gone to Wakefield, as his crimes had no sexual element to them, but we were the only ones that had space for a prisoner needing that level of security and scrutiny. He was a big guy. I wasn't expecting that, to be honest. Usually with that kind of prisoner, they've got a you'd never know to look at them sort of feeling, but Montauk looked like a killer. He must have been almost 6'6" and built like a barge. His dark hair was cropped close to his scalp, showing off a flat, angular face. Not to put too fine a point on it, but the man was terrifying. When he entered the rec room for the first time, I could almost hear the deflating egos as a dozen would-be hoodlums thought better of trying to make a reputation by standing up to Robert Montauk. Of course, there's always one. And in this case, it was Ivan Ilic, an aspiring Serbian gangster who decided to go after him, jumping him from the side. Me and the other warders had been waiting for something like this, but we were too slow to get there in time. Well, maybe we could have gone faster. 40 murders. Sometimes you want to look at what you're up against. Ilic was not a small man and nearly matched Montauk in height, if not in weight. But there was an energy to Montauk, a tightness, like a rubber band about to snap. Ilic leapt forward with a shout and delivered a solid punch right into the other man's kidneys, but it was as though he'd hit the pressure pad on a bear trap. With terrifying speed, the hands snapped round, gripping the Serbian's right arm. There was a half moment of complete silence, as everyone seemed to be holding their breath to see what Robert Montauk did next. He brought his hands around with a violent twist, cleanly dislocating his assailant's arm with a nasty pop, and replacing the silence with a scream and a string of Slavic curse words. At this point, me and the other screws broke it up. I got the unenviable task of taking the still cursing Ivan Illich down to get his arm treated. I didn't see Montauk again for some time. After that little incident, he was immediately transferred over to F Block, where he wasn't going to be a danger to anyone but himself. I'd occasionally hear rumors about him filtering through the other inmates, and there wasn't a spooky story in Wakefield that didn't have him at the center of it. Barely a week went by without some loudmouth nobody spreading word that he'd killed a guard, or escaped, or been found dead in his cell with his heart ripped out. It was never true, of course, not at that point. I think most of it came from Dave Harrington on F-Wing. He always loved to drop fake gossip on new inmates, and the old hands knew not to trust a word he said. It was 1998 when... Hello?
Hey, I just
Oh,
wanted
hold on. Sorry, can't be too careful. Accidentally mentioned you on one of my earlier official recordings and had to go back over it.
Oh, sure. I've got another tape for you.
Fantastic. Here's the other one.
Was there anything on it?
Oh, very much so. A Russian circus that... Oh, but, nothing relevant to Gertrude's murder, if that's what you mean.
It is what I mean.
Right, sorry. Have you had a chance to listen to any of them yourself?
Well, the precinct has exactly one tape player, and it exploded when I tried to put batteries in it.
Oh.
Put in a requisition for a new one, but that's lost somewhere in the Met, and I haven't had a chance to chase it up, so...
Well, if you keep bringing them to me...
It's better than nothing, yeah. Anyway, I thought you could try this one next.
Alexandria?
Hey, at least this one actually has a label. I figured you're probably into old libraries and stuff,
No,
so...
you're right. Thank you, Miss. Honestly.
Yeah. Oh, what's the name of that helper of yours?
Martin.
No, the hot one. He has scars like you, but kind of manages to pull them off.
Tim.
Yeah, what's his deal? He gave me the weirdest grin when I came in just now, and like, a thumbs up.
I wouldn't worry about it.
No?
He thinks we're sort of together.
Oh, no. You know I'm
No,
not...
I know. I mean, he just got it in his head.
I mean, you're nice and all.
Yes, no, I feel the same way.
Right. I mean, I suppose it's better he think that.
I won't tell if you won't.
Right. I'm gonna go then.
Yes. Right. Statement resumes. It was in 1998 that I next came into regular contact with Robert Montauk. The government had commissioned the construction of close supervision centres in prisons all over the country, and Wakefield was one of the flagship initiatives. A good portion of F-Wing was given over to our own CSC, soon to be known as the Exceptional Risk Unit. It could only hold 8 prisoners, but they were to be the worst of the worst, kept under constant scrutiny and given no chance to harm anyone. I was picked to be one of the officers transferred into the new unit. I don't know if it was specifically because I had more inmate altercations on my record than any other prison officer at Wakefield, but given the intensity of the setup, I'm sure it didn't hurt my application. Robert Montauk was an obvious choice for the Exceptional Risk Unit. During his time in Wakefield, he had been involved in several further violent incidents, and though he hadn't yet killed anyone inside the prison, the higher-ups reckoned it was only a matter of time. So in he went. The CSC was not a nice place. Wakefield had had the budget to make it secure, but not to make it anything less than starkly utilitarian. The individual cells were cramped and claustrophobic, with almost no natural light filtering in from the outside. Oh, they still got their exercise, but it was in bare metal cages. We kept them separated from each other almost as much as we kept them from the rest of the prison. You must never underestimate how violent and desperate a trapped animal can become. We were cruel to them. I'm not ashamed of that. If I were to tell you all the crimes of those monsters we kept in the ERU, you'd probably lose your lunch before I was halfway through the list. Keeping them beat down was the only way to make sure they behaved. Besides, atonement is important. I'll admit though, I always had a soft spot for Robert Montauk. He never gave us any trouble. Away from the other prisoners, he seemed docile, almost eerily so sometimes. Also, and it's a small thing, but he never denied his crimes. Wakefield is one of those prisons where everyone is innocent, and it gets so dull to hear their whining protestations day after day. Anyone who fully owned their crimes always went up in my estimation. I mean, we still beat him down on occasion, but not as bad as the others. After a year or two, I kind of started to forget who he was, you know? The mystique of being Britain's most successful serial killer just didn't hold up. When you have someone in your power like that, you forget any respect you might have had for them. And he never gave us any trouble. In 2001, he started to get visitors, his daughter mostly. Given that she hadn't visited before, I'd guess she just turned 18. You get that a lot. Unaccompanied visits aren't allowed under that age, and plenty of inmates have kids living with overprotective guardians who refuse to take them, so I assumed she was similar. The visitor rooms in the main prison are quite nice. Not so much in the exceptional risk unit. A dark, bare room like all of them, cut down the middle with a reinforced window. There were plenty of lights in there, but somehow it always seemed gloomy. I was on observation for a few of their father-daughter visits. She would talk about her life like her dad wasn't a murderer. He would lie about how it wasn't too bad in the prison. It was all very touching, I'm sure. Aside from his daughter, there was only one other time that he had a visitor. It was 6 months before he died, late March 2002. It was an older guy, I'd guess late 50s, wearing a well-tailored black suit and an expression of disgust. When I brought Montauk in, his face fell, and he went very pale. I'd helped folks beat Robert Montauk a dozen times or more, but I had never seen him look scared. He sat down opposite the old man, and they looked each other in the eye through the thick glass. I think the visitor might have been blind. His eyes were cloudy, but he had no cane or dog, and it didn't seem to affect how he looked at Montauk. Neither of them spoke. The seconds turned into minutes, and still they didn't say a word. They just sat there staring. Given where I worked, it's really something to be able to say that I've never seen two people who hated each other as much as Robert Montauk and that old man. After a few minutes, I was all but ready to drag him out, but as I stepped forward, the lights blew. All of them at once, leaving us in the dark. I had Pete Gordo, the warder, with me on visitor duty, fumbling for the handle on the door to get help or torches. I was tense, ready to fight off Montauk if he decided to make a move, but instead, a soft voice came from out of the darkness. I didn't recognize it, but I thought it sounded like it came from the old man. I don't think he was talking to me. You didn't think you could kill it for long, did you? That's what it said. Then Pete got the door open, and a shaft of light poured in from the corridor. I could once again see Montauk and the old man sat there, motionless. It didn't seem like they'd moved an inch, though as I went to take Montauk back to his cell, I noticed that he was crying. I didn't mention it. I'll be honest, I was kind of freaked out by the whole thing. The next few months were quiet. Montauk seemed even more subdued than normal, and often had to be goaded into exercising during his allotted time. The only point where he seemed normal was when his daughter came for her visits, and maybe that was just because he was already so used to lying to her. That was the summer we had all the plumbing problems in the ERU, and the water kept going foul, so we were all kind of on edge. But nothing really happened until it turned into autumn. November rolled around. It was November the 1st. I remember because the date was read out so many damn times at the assorted disciplinaries that followed. The worst part of it is I wasn't even doing anything wrong that day. I was working the late shift with Pete, and we were having coffee in the break room. At least, I was having coffee. Pete was swearing at the taps because the plumbing problem we had all been assured was fixed was back, and worse than ever. The taps were disgorging a jet of foul-smelling, stagnant water. I was laughing at him, sipping my own perfectly adequate drink, when all the lights went off. It was more widespread than last time, though. It seemed like the electricity had gone off altogether. We stood there in the pitch black, waiting for the generator to kick in or for whatever power problem this was to be fixed. But after a few minutes of silence and darkness,
Yeah, I really like
it became clear that
Berserker.
wasn't happening anytime soon. In the distance, we could hear the prisoners of the exceptional risk unit start to shout and holler. Their cells were locked, of course. There was nothing a power cut could do about that. But it was still up to us to keep order until the lights came back.
1 second. Okay, yeah, it works.
I had hoped that the other prison officers on shift would have come by to pick us up, but they were clearly busy elsewhere.
I'm trying to do
I called
2
out to
new
Pete, making sure he was
DLCs.
still nearby as I fumbled in the locker for my torch. I finally found it and turned it on. The beam was so bright in the oppressive darkness that I had to blink away tears. Using the light from mine, Pete
Okay.
found his own flashlight, and together we headed out into the CSC. We checked each cell in turn, lying to the prisoners inside about when the power would come back, sending them back to their beds with threats of violence. I didn't see any of the other warders around, and was starting to get really nervous. When we had checked all the other cells, we went towards Robert Montauk's. The torch beams shot out in front of us, but as they fell upon the door to his cell, something was wrong. I wasn't quite sure what I was looking at for a second, and then I realized that his cell door was open, and the torchlight wasn't reaching the inside. As it hit the threshold, it just stopped. A clear and distinct line of darkness, beyond which nothing could be seen. From inside there came the wet sound of tearing and a low moan of pain. I wanted to run, but instead I took a step forward, and my torch died. Pete's went off as well, and we just stood there terrified, unable to see a thing. The sounds were no longer coming from inside the cell, and that didn't reassure me as much as it might have. About 15 feet behind me, I heard Pete fumbling around, calling out my name. I was about to reply, tell him to stay where he was, when I heard something that froze my blood. Pete said, "Hey, Mom." He was not touching me. Almost immediately there was a growl from the darkness. It was throaty and a roar, but at the same time sounded almost musical. Pete screamed and I heard him fall to the floor. It was at that moment that the lights came back on. We were alone. I ran to do a quick circuit of the CSC as the other prison officers arrived, but there was no one else there. Apparently there'd been some problems with the doors, and they hadn't been able to get to the main ERU cells. Pete was still on the ground when I returned, though he seemed physically unharmed. It was one of the other warders that found what was left of Robert Montauk. I took the fall for it. They didn't try to make out like I had killed him, just that it had happened on my watch and due to my negligence. They'd been trying to push me out ever since the prison inspectorate had written the CSC up for excessive use of force the year before. They really threw the book at me. Gross incompetence. It's a bitter phrase to say out loud. What was I supposed to tell them? A monster made of darkness murdered him? Pete was no help. He handed in his notice 2 hours after the lights came back on. I didn't even get a chance to speak to him, ask what had happened. He was just gone. I don't really have anything more to say about it. It was a clearly paranormal incident that led to the end of my career. It's not fair. Statement ends. Prison records are very hard to acquire for the close supervision centers. Due to the small number of inmates held there, most information could be considered identifying, so the prison service tends to hide behind data protection laws when asked about them. Beyond that, many of the prison records from before the mid-2000s have still not been digitized, making follow-up on this hard. Tim hit something of a dead end trying to look up Peter Gordo, though Sasha did manage to track down the 2002 visitor logs from the Westwood prison.
What?
It took some searching, but I managed to find what I believe to be the entry for the visit from Mr. Brown's mysterious old man. The name given was Maxwell Rayner. Martin hasn't had much luck tracking down Mr. Brown himself. According to Caroline Brody, his ex-wife, she left him in 2004 after his dismissal from the prison service pushed him further into alcoholism and he became abusive. She says she got a single letter from him in 2009 asking for reconciliation, but she never received. Martin says the letter was postmarked from Waterford in Ireland, but he's been unable to track Mr. Brown any further. So what is this thing that seems to have stalked Robert Montauk through so much of his life? And what's its connection to Rayner? Were they summoning it, containing it, worshipping it? Whatever the case, it seems as though Montauk earned its anger. I feel it might be worthwhile getting a few more torches.
What the fuck?
Supplemental. I confronted Sasha about the wax museum. It was just too strange to not mention. I tried to pass it off like I had spotted her accidentally while in the area for other reasons. I doubt she bought it, but she did at least give me an answer. She has a boyfriend, or so she claims, who works there. She likes to get lunch with him. It is plausible. And at this stage I feel challenging her to produce said boyfriend would potentially damage what trust remains between us. No luck with any of my other leads yet. But at least I have another of Gertrude's tapes. It's always going to be a shot in the dark with them, but hopefully an informative one. I know the secret to her death. One of them it must be. I hope I don't have to hear it firsthand. End supplement.
My gun. I really need more defense. Little toads.
Not enough energy. Not enough energy.
$1,500. Oh. Okay. But why doesn't this work? Je comprends pas. Je ne comprends pas. Mm-hmm. Right. It just still doesn't work.
A human face. I despair of ever seeing another. Kind traveler, I thought these ruins were deserted.
thought they would tear me on the reason home.
Okay. I need some potions.
Thank you, my sister.
Oh fuck, I don't have butts.
This cannot be opened.
Yep. Butts. I'll check if I. Yep.
The Magnus Archives is a podcast distributed by Rusty.
Rusty Quill presents The Magnus Archives. Episode 53, Crusader.
Are you quite recovered?
Yes, I think so. Well enough to tell my story, at least.
Ah, good. Sergeant Walter Heller recording regarding a discovery made near Alexandria during Operation Crusader in November of 1941. Recording date 5th of September 1997. Anytime you're ready.
Right. Where do you want me to start?
Well, you say you were serving in North Africa when it happened.
Yes, I was with the 2nd Royal Gloucestershire Hussars. We weren't even meant to be down in Libya originally, but when the pushback against Rommel started, the whole brigade was reassigned. We were going to help with Operation Crusader. Well, that was fine by me. My brother Francis had died at Arras when the Germans had pushed through the year before. Rommel had been in command then as well, and I hated him for it. I knew I'd never get to do anything about it, but I always used to carry an old picture of him I'd clipped from a newspaper, and I made sure to keep it in my pack, so I'd know him if I saw him again, or just in case. Well, there were 4 of us on the tank crew. Frank Malloy was in command, Ralph McClellar did the driving, and we had a loader by the name of Dicky. Well, I'm afraid I don't remember his second name. He wasn't with us very long. I was the gunner. I've always had good eyes, you see, and you really need that for the gun. It's all very well for Frank to point at a speck on the horizon and give us the order to fire, but I'm the one that needs to line up the shot close to a mile away and turn a Nazi tank into a smouldering wreck before they can do the same to us. I was good at it, though I managed to get 3 M1340s when the fighting started. I would have liked to have had a crack at the Panzer, but it was the Italians who caught up with us at Bir el Gabir, so I never had a chance. Maybe it was just as well. By all accounts, the Germans had a lot more training, so maybe it would have gone even worse for us. But I still hated having to waste time on the Italians when I knew Rommel and his panzers were out there in the desert somewhere. It was all a bit of a mess, to be honest, that battle. Our air support were meant to have bombed their airfields to rubble, but weather had kept them grounded, so we were being hounded by German planes the whole time. The Italians had unsurprisingly taken a page out of Rommel's handbook, and they backed up their tanks with heavy infantry support, while we were left almost entirely on our own. Frank took to the machine gun when he could keep it pinned down, but it was hard enough to keep our eyes on the enemy tanks without constantly having to worry about a Panzerfaust coming out of view from nowhere. We were still in the Crusader Mark I's back then, so we had the speed to keep ahead of them. But I was basically useless when we were driving, and any time we stopped long enough for me to get an eye on the Italian tank, we ended up a sitting duck for their infantry. All told, I think taking down 3 of them was a pretty good effort. You know, it was hot that day. I hadn't been in the desert more than a couple of weeks by then, and the sheer heat of the place was still something of a shock. I'm from Cheltenham, you see, so not exactly used to the blazing sun of a Libyan desert. And the Crusader, well, for all its advantages, didn't have very much in the way of ventilation, so we were spending a lot of time trapped in what was more or less a mobile oven. Even then, I could just about stand it. But once the fighting got going and the guns started firing, well, it was only a 2-pounder, but still, the heat was almost unbearable. It was about 2 hours into the battle that it happened. The gun was now so hot I couldn't touch it. and I was having to wipe a steady stream of sweat from my eyes every few seconds. The whole desert seemed to swell and sway in the heat haze, but I dimly heard Frank call an order to fire on the tank from the east. Ralph brought the Crusader to a stop, and I heard poor Dickie call from inside that we were clear to fire, swearing all the time over his burnt fingers. I could see the dark shape of an Italian gun in the distance, and was trying to get the angle right, but my vision was so hazy from the intense heat that it was hard to focus my binoculars properly. Then I saw it, a flash of light, a twinkling glint of sun from the enemy tank. In the back of my mind I knew what it meant, the sun reflecting off their own binoculars, which were trained on us, but my head was so foggy that for all the world it seemed as though they were winking at me. I tried to say something to the rest of the crew, but my mouth was too dry, and all that came out was a dull croak. It was strange, but even with the intense sunlight reflecting off that endless expanse of bright desert, I still remember seeing the flash of their gun. I didn't hear it, though. They always say that, don't they? That you never hear the shot that gets you. Well, I certainly didn't. Then I was on the ground, with Frank and Ralph standing over me. Ralph was trying to say something, but I couldn't hear it over the intense ringing in my ears. There was the smell of burning metal, and below it another scent I couldn't quite place. I tried to sit up, but there was such an intense shooting pain in my left leg as I did so that I collapsed again. A few yards away I could hear our Crusader, smoke pouring from a cracked armour. It surprised me how intact she seemed until I saw the flames creeping up from the hatch. It was then the ringing in my ears faded enough for me to hear it. The screaming from inside the tank. Dickie was still in there. I looked at my companions and saw in their faces that they heard it too. There was nothing they could have done to save the poor fool, of course. If they had trapped him in there, then getting to him would have been impossible, and trying would only have got them killed. So I had to lie there and listen to Dickie roast to death. I don't know how long it took, but it felt like hours. At some point, there must have been a retreat ordered as I saw the rest of the Crusaders pulling back. Frank managed to catch the attention of one of them, and the commander agreed to take me back somewhere the medics could get a look at my leg.
Hey?
Although there
Okay, I'll try that. Thanks.
So they literally strapped me to the top of the tank, and we drove off, leaving Ralph and Frank to make their own way back. It wasn't until I tracked Ralph down almost 10 years later that I found they had been captured, and soon afterwards spent the rest of the war in an Italian POW camp. Or the way they described it had been quite comfortable. But as far as I knew, at the time we were leaving them to
Thanks
the
for that. I didn't know.
If it hadn't been so delirious with heat and pain, I might have cried. My memory of the trip back is fragmented, and I have only faint impressions of the pain which every vibration of the tank's engine sent to my injured leg as I passed in and out of consciousness. Then there was stillness, shouting. I remember a faint prick in my arm, and then a different sort of haze settled over my mind as numbness and sleep spread through my veins. The next thing I recall with any clarity is my hospital bed. I'd been taken over the border back to Egypt and had ended up in the British military hospital in Alexandria. When I awoke, it was so quiet that for a minute I had the sudden panic thought that I might be deaf. But it was just that after so many days hearing the roar of one engine or another, the peace of an almost empty hospital was so deep and serene that I couldn't understand it. When she came round, the nurse was kind enough to inform me that I was one of the first wounded to have returned from Berserker, but they were expecting more. Sure enough, over the next few days the ward filled up, and my piece slipped away beneath the steady stream of injured soldiers. I didn't mind too much, as it was still a damn sight better than rolling over the boiling desert in an iron coffin, not to mention the fact that it turned out I wasn't going to lose the leg, which is the sort of news to put you in a very good mood. The doctors told me I'd probably always have a limp, as I'm sure you've noticed, but it wasn't infected, and there wasn't the nerve damage they'd been afraid of, so all told it was a pretty good wound to get. After a few weeks, I was walking on without too much pain, and the nurses advised me to start taking
I have to go after the Three Sisters now.
I did so, but between the locals and the army, it was a crowded, noisy place, even at night. I took to taking my walks further and further from the hospital and the city centre, and occasionally I'd find myself wandering some way beyond the city limits, at least as far as my leg would allow. It was still hot, even in late December, but beyond the edge of the city there was a peaceful quiet that I just couldn't find anywhere else. It was 2 days before I was due to return to active duty that it happened. I'd been restless all week, and I couldn't seem to settle down or focus on anything. Once I got out near Pompidou, the crowd seemed to disperse, and my mind finally cleared a bit. I kept walking, though not paying any real attention to my surroundings, until I found myself rather lost. After several hours, my leg was starting to ache badly, and I took a moment or two to rest against the nearby door. The wood of the door was
So I
old
need to
and
attack the
dry,
one
and creaked as I put my weight against it. I didn't even notice it buckling till it was too late. The next thing I knew, I was lying face down in this dingy basement, my legs screaming in fresh pain. It wasn't broken again, which was a relief, but I still had to sit there for a while, recovering from my fall. Nobody seemed to have noticed what had happened, or at least they didn't care, and I took a few moments to think exactly where I was. The basement looked old, really old. I'm not an expert on Egyptian architecture, but it didn't look much like the rest of Alexandria. More than that, aside from the now broken door, there didn't seem to be any end to the place, or anything connecting it to the building above. It was dry and cool, and there didn't seem to be anything else of note, except for an old plate made of brass or maybe bronze that I assumed led to the city's sewer system. It was, as I finally painfully dragging myself to my feet, that I saw it. Somewhere far beyond the grate, as the setting sun fell on it, came the glimpse of something round and white. It was only for a second, and I hadn't spent so long training to spot objects at distance, I probably wouldn't have noticed it, but there was definitely something there. I approached the metal grate, expecting to smell the sewer beyond, but instead there came the sense of something else. All that at that point I had no idea what it was, but I would have described it as not unlike wood. I tested the grate and found it came away easily off the floor, leaving a hole large enough to climb through without any problem. I had taken to keeping a torch with me on my walks, as I sometimes had a tendency to wander too far, and so I'd be walking back in the dark. Shining it into the now open hole revealed what looked like to be an old tunnel. Whether it was man-made, a naturally occurring cave, or somewhere in between, I couldn't say, but it was easily big enough for me to walk down, and once again I saw that glint of pale white a long way down, so I went in. It was slow going, as my leg was still loose, and the floor of the tunnel was not level. I had to crouch at points and place my hands upon the dusty walls for support. After a few minutes, I was deep enough that my torch was the only source of light, and the passage began to open up into what seemed to be a larger room. It was there, in a small alcove carved into the wall, that I saw what I caught the light. It was an old papyrus scroll, lying amongst the shattered remnants of its case. I cast my torch around and saw more shelves carved into the walls of the chamber, each of which housed a scroll of its own. They were written in a language I didn't recognize, but they were old and they smelt of age and dry decay. It wasn't the only room like that. There were dozens of chambers like it, all of different shapes and sizes, connected like a warren. Some were empty, others still had a handful of old scrolls left in alcoves or fallen to the floor. It looked like the place had been looted long time ago. After checking through a few rooms, I was sure that whatever this was, it must have been a huge archaeological find. I really didn't know who to tell about it, but I knew I needed to tell somebody. As I turned to head back towards the entrance, my torch beam fell upon something dark in an adjoining room. It was a body. From the looks of it, the corpse had been dead a long time, and the dry air had almost mummified it, leaving a desiccated skin stretched tight over the bony frame. It wore what looked to be the remains of chainmail, and a black cloth tabard with a pointed white
just
cross
something.
blazed on the chest. A broken sword lay nearby, now rusted almost into nothing. As I gazed at the dead man's face, I couldn't stop a chill running down my spine. I tried to tell myself that it was just the way the skull had walked over the years that made him look like he was screaming. His eyes were gone, but rather than simply decaying into nothingness, there were ragged scratches around the edge of the socket, leaving messy, hollow pits. I was feeling very afraid now, and had just turned around to leave when my torch abruptly turned off. It was the strangest thing. It should have been pitch dark. There was no light at all filtering through into those underground caverns. But still, I could see everything. Every detail of the shore walked before me was as clear as day, though there was no light to see it. I can't explain it, even really describe how it felt. But it was absolute darkness and I could still see. At the same time, I suddenly got the most intense feeling of being watched, like 1,000 eyes turned to me in front. I froze. From somewhere, deeper within that strange ancient library, there was the sound of movement, the rustling of cloth, slow, rhythmic steps coming toward me. I started to back away, towards the tunnel that had brought me there, but it was hard. The sense of being watched was getting stronger, an almost physical weight that seemed to drag me down. I reached the mouth of the tunnel just as a figure came into view. It wore what looked like the remains of an ancient robe, and in the darkness I could see long, spindly fingers stretching, holding toward me. Within its huge, flowing hood, I could see nothing except a single lidless eye. I don't know at what point I started screaming, but I know I didn't stop until I was restrained by military police, fleeing through the streets of Alexandria in the early hours of the morning. I spent another month there undergoing psychiatric evaluation before being discharged.
I see. Did you ever locate that basement again?
Well, I wanted to, but I was supervised the rest of my time in Alexandria.
Did you tell any of your superiors about it?
No, I was half convinced I'd dreamt the whole thing up.
And did you replace the grate?
The what?
The bronze grate over the entrance to the archive. Did you replace it when you fled?
Yes, I think I did.
One other thing. That feeling of being watched, have you ever had it since?
Well, I wasn't sure whether to say anything, but yes, I have, just now. That funny turn I took on the way down the stairs. I felt it again. All those eyes watching me.
Thank you, Walter. Now, I need to check some maps with you, but I don't think we need that on tape. Are you all right here for now?
Well, I should be.
It's unlikely to happen, but if anyone else comes down here...
I'll tell them I'm an old friend of yours, paying you a visit.
Thank you. This statement is off the record, and I don't want anyone to bother you about it further. Let's keep it between us. Well, that was certainly useful. It's taken a long time to track down someone still living who found the Serapeum of Alexandria. It's not a full confirmation of my theory about ancient iterations of the archive, but I'm certainly feeling validated for pursuing it. I'd been working on the assumption that the Great Library itself would have fulfilled the function, but it makes a lot more sense that it would have been the Serapeum offshoot. The ruins of the main Serapeum itself, near Pompey's Pillar, are quite well researched, so this could be the secret caves mentioned in certain accounts of its destruction. According to Eunapius, the destruction of the Serapeum in 391 AD was conducted by a Christian mob, emboldened by the reforms of Pope Theodosius I, attempting to drive the worship of all other gods from Alexandria. There are other accounts, however, that claim the scholars barricaded themselves inside with prisoners and retreated to hidden caverns deep below. Some even go so far as to claim the captains were tortured into the worship of pagan deities, or offered as blood sacrifices. There's even one unnamed contemporary historian that describes the mob attacking the Serapeum not as Christians, but using a phrase which roughly translates as those who sing the night. The corpse found by Mr. Heller would seem to be the remains of a Hospitaller Knight of the Order of St. John.
Not
At
since
least
Perth.
based on his
Well,
description of
you're
the tabard,
quite the hero.
most likely from the sack of Alexandria, 1365, by Peter I of Cyprus. While generally grouped in with the rest of the Crusades, it's generally considered to be one of the few such attacks with no religious motivation. Given this discovery, however, I do wonder if there might have been other reasons. Regardless, I have further follow-up of my own to do. My biggest concern right now is whatever creature Mr. Heller encountered down there. It was 56 years ago. But if it's still alive, I should be careful. What was it? Guardian of some sort, or perhaps
I have to go, so...
Two was once an archivist.